What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be talking about the Alkosh set and why it's used on tanks rather than DPS, and we'll also take a look at the actual DPS comparison, taking a look at Alkosh and a couple other more traditional quote-unquote standard DPS sets. So this is a topic that I've seen thrown around way more often than I anticipated being seen, and it mostly comes up from the official forums. I have seen it a few times on Reddit. But it kind of stems to the idea that Alkosh should not be a tank set because it is a medium armor set, and the bonuses that it has are more geared towards DPS rather than actual tankiness. So I thought I'd address those points today, kind of show why Alkosh is best on a tank rather than a melee DPS, and as well as go over a few parses to kind of show you guys why Alkosh actually isn't that great on a melee DPS, despite the fact that it is medium armor and the bonuses are geared more towards, doing better at DPS. So the first thing that I kind of want to touch on, which I think is the main sort of origin of this sort of misconception, is the fact that a lot of people seem to think that tanks in ESO are supposed to be like tanks in other MMOs. Now, I haven't played a lot of other MMOs, but from what I have gathered from speaking with other people who do have experience in other MMOs, tanks in other MMOs, generally speaking, are more or less just damage sponges. They just eat up damage, they hold aggression on the enemies, and just take the hits, maybe have a lot of self-heals, maybe provide a little bit of additional damage, but for the most part, they're just eat up the hits, and that's kind of their job. Tanking in ESO, on the other hand, is very different. It's basically more geared towards building yourself so you're tanky enough to survive, a heavy attack with your blocking, things like that. And beyond that, you're pretty much just there to support the group. So you're there to kind of maximize overall group DPS. You're there to debuff the enemy as much as you can. So, again, maximizing group DPS. And that's kind of the whole idea of tanking behind ESO. It's less of a meat sponge, more of a sort of support role. And so I think that's where that sort of disconnect is sort of stemming from, this idea that tanks in ESO should be tanky, which is true to a certain extent. Obviously, you don't want to be tanking in light armor necessarily. But like I said, a lot of tanks in ESO, especially towards the endgame PvE realm, like Mayflower, Alkosh, Hodor, Symbolic, a lot of those guys, myself included, we just build more so we are tanky enough to survive any big hits. And once we have kind of found that happy middle ground, then we focus in on buffing and debuffing. That's where sets like Alkosh, moves like Aggressive Warhorn, that's where those sets come in. So I see a lot of tanks saying, well, you should be using Leeching, you should be using Plague Doctor. Evan's really bad because it doesn't give you as much health as Plague Doctor does, and that's not really the case in ESO. I think a lot of these people are kind of taking their sort of idea of a tank from other MMOs and from what, quote, traditional tanks do in other RPG games, things like maybe Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, where the tank is just there to soak up damage and not really support the group, where in ESO it's more about building yourself so you can survive the damage, but also support the group at the same time. So that's really where it falls, I think where that misconception sort of falls. So the first thing I kind of want to point out here is actually the set itself. So for those of you guys who don't know what Alkosh does, here it is. So Alkosh is a medium armor set that comes from Maul Florkage, so it comes in medium armor on the body, and it also comes in jewelry and weapons. So traditionally on a tank, you see them run the jewelry and the weapons because, tanking medium armor, while it is a thing in a couple of niche fights, is not really something you necessarily want to be doing as a main tank. So you have weapon crit, weapon damage, minor slayer, and then a 5-piece when you activate a synergy, you send out a shockwave for your position that deals, in this case, 2304 physical damage and additional, again in this case, 15,890 physical damage over 10 seconds. And the secondary part of this reduces the physical and spell resistance of any enemy hit by 3010 for 10 seconds. And that's really where the corner support slash debuff role comes in with Alkosh. So you will notice that the proc condition for the 5-piece is when you activate a synergy. Now, when it comes to synergies and overall raid environment in ESO, tanks are generally speaking going to be in the best position to receive as many synergies as you can. So if you have any Magsorks in group, you have a lot of lightning floods or liquid lightnings being dropped pretty much right on top of the boss. Tank's always going to be on top of the boss. You will have shards thrown on you as a tank. You will typically be within the Purify extended ritual from Templar healers. You're going to be getting budding seeds from your Warden healers. You might be getting Blood Altar synergies if you're running Blood Altars, and if your healers are running Blood Altars. So generally speaking, tanks are in the best position to get those synergies in order to activate Alkosh. DPS, on the other hand, yes, you might be able to get that Liquid Lightning synergy from the Magsork since you're in melee range. You will obviously be getting orbs, so you will be having those synergies, and of course Purify, Budding Seeds, and the Blood Altar synergies are all fair game as well. However, a lot of those, the last three synergies that I mentioned, really involve taking damage and actually getting a deep. So you need a debuff, for example, in order to use the Purify synergy. You need to be below 70% health in order to use the Blood Altar synergy. So, you know, in an ideal world, you won't be taking that much damage in order to activate these synergies. So in those instances, those synergies might not necessarily be consistent on a DPS compared to a tank, where you're always getting damage. You're pretty much always going to be getting some sort of debuff you can purify, so you're going to be able to get those synergies a lot more consistently that way. That's one aspect as to why on a tank. And then the other thing too is that it sends out a shockwave. So it's a little bit difficult to see because there's no like very clear indication, but it's basically a conal shockwave that spreads out about 16 feet or so, 16 meters I should say, in front of you. So a little bit less than the range of a blockade, elemental blockade. So about 16 meters or so. Now, it is a conal, so it's very similar to Twisting Path on a Nightblade. So if you're used to seeing how Twisting Path works, then you will be very used to kind of seeing how Alkosh works. And so that shockwave, that frontal conal shockwave, again, tanks are in the best position in order to kind of hit things with this shockwave. They're typically going to be the ones that are grouping adds together. They'll typically be the ones facing the boss, because it will shoot off in the direction you are facing. The character is actually facing the direction that the shockwave will kind of spit out. And so melee DPS, while yes, in most instances you will be right up next to the boss, you are not necessarily going to be on the boss the whole time depending on the fight. So for example, in fights with adds, you might not necessarily be on the main boss. The adds might take precedence. So for example, you might be hitting the Hulk in Rakat, in the Rakat fight in Maw of Lorkhaj. That instance, you might not necessarily be facing the correct direction in order to hit Rakat with the Alkosh debuff. On the other hand, the tank will always be facing Rakat because tanking Rakat, so he will always be able to hit Rakat with that Alkosh debuff. That's another reason why Alkosh is not necessarily best on a melee DPS, might be better on a tank instead. So those are the real big misconceptions that I've seen with Alkosh, and why, in my opinion, it's best to be put on a tank rather than on melee DPS. Now, some people have argued, well, why don't you just put it on melee DPS? It is a melee set. It's a medium armor set. It deals damage on the 5-piece. It can't be that bad in order to put it on a melee DPS and allow a tank, if you need it, to be a little bit more tanky, to wear more tanky, selfish sets, for example, maybe in progression groups. Now, that is a valid argument to make. Alkosh is a medium armor set, and it does deal damage on the 5-piece, so you would imagine that it does okay DPS, maybe not necessarily competitive with the meta, but it should deal fairly competitive DPS, you would think. So I am on the, before I go into these parses, I am on the PTS server right now, and for mainly two main reasons. First one, I want to include Tooth of Locustes in there because that seems to be the new meta set for stamina DPS, and two, because Alkosh does need a synergy, I do need to use the raid dummy in order to actually activate Alkosh. Now, this is going to be a little bit of an underestimation for the uptime of Alkosh in an actual raid. Like I mentioned earlier, you might be getting some additional synergies in order to increase your uptimes. Plus, from what I've heard, I have not actually tested this myself, but the damage over time component for Alkosh I've heard can stack on itself, so you might be able to get a little bit more DPS this way. So the Alkosh parse is going to be a little bit of an underestimation, although depending on a specific fight, it might be more or less what you would expect to see. But again, there is that sort of rumor that the damage over time component can't stack on each other. So I did 4 tests all on a Stamina Nightblade, so I only swapped out the front bar set, so I used Alkosh, Fancy Okada, Tooth of Locustes, and War Machine, so I did 4 total parses on the raid dummy here. I used Reliquin and Veldreths as my other sets here, and I did use Gold Food, CPs and rotation pretty much remain exactly the same for your meta Nightblade setup. The only thing that is a little bit different is that it did use Dark Shade here, because does turn out that this is actually pretty decent because of the way that it now scales in Elsewhere. So here are the parses themselves. So we have these 4 parses. These are the parses that we have here. So I'm just going to throw them up. 1, 2, 3, local memory 4. Right, so this first parse here, this is the Alkosh parse, and we managed to get 43% uptime on the debuff. Again, this is a little bit of an underestimation. You might be getting a little bit higher in an actual raid environment, because you might be getting some more synergies. You see here we did 43.3k. We're rounding up to the nearest 100th. This is the Advanced Yokeda parse, so we did 76.3k here. This is the Toothed Locustes parse, 77.6k. This is the War Machine parse, 75.3k. So we can see here that Alkosh is not doing very hot right now. And another thing that we also want to keep in mind is that the raid dummy currently does not seem to have Alkosh debuff applied on it already. So this parse, the Alkosh parse, does have higher penetration. So our max was 8600 compared to 5590 across the other 3 parses. So even with the additional penetration, we are doing less DPS overall. If we were to adjust these to account for the increased penetration, so if we were to adjust Advanced Yokeda, Locustes, and the War Machine parses, the gap would only increase further. Now, why is Alkosh not doing so hot, even with the higher sort of penetration value? Well, first of all, you guys are overestimating how much damage the Alkosh proc can actually do. So it is a Roar of Alkosh. This is the initial hit here, so 137 DPS. And this is damage over time, 918. If we add these together, it ends up being around 1050. To give you guys some comparisons here, Corrosive Slash, this is one of the attacks from the Dark Shade. This deals just pretty much the exact same, maybe a little bit less DPS compared to what Alkosh is able to pull here. The reason why Alkosh is doing so poorly is because it does not crit. It is a set bonus. It is a proc set, which means it cannot crit. So you're not able to crit on this at all, and you can see here the damage itself per tick is actually not that great. At max, it's 3000. And again, if you take a look at these numbers here, Incapacitating Strike did more DPS than the Roar of Alkosh proc did. And of course, with higher Alkosh uptimes, these numbers will obviously increase. But this is mainly the reason why Alkosh is not a great set, because of the fact that it cannot crit at all. So you're wasting a lot of DPS this way, compared to using something like Advanced Yokeda here, where it's increasing all of your critical hits. So much larger increase in DPS, particularly because we are using the Shadow Mundus. And then obviously Major Slayer is a huge buff to your DPS for both the War Machine and Toothed Locustes parse. So that's probably the main reason why Alkosh is not doing as good DPS as you would think, because it cannot crit, and it doesn't. The other bonuses, while they are decent, they don't really add all too much. You're already getting Minor Slayer from pretty much everything except Advancing Yokeda here, and so the weapon crit and the weapon damage, while they are obviously stamina DPS oriented, they just don't compare. The 5 pieces just don't compare to Advanced Yokeda, to the Locustes, and even War Machine is doing better than Alkosh. So that's pretty much it. That is why Alkosh is better suited as a tank rather than a melee DPS. Obviously, the conditions under which Alkosh is going to be most beneficial, best suits for tank. And even if you wanted to use it on a melee DPS, there are other sets that are able to pull even better DPS overall. So again, the smallest gap here was between War Machine and Alkosh at 2k DPS without adjustment for the additional penetration you get from Alkosh. So with the adjustment, this gap would probably increase to maybe 3, maybe even 4k DPS overall. So Alkosh is just not that strong of a set on melee DPS. So that is it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.